Billions of people across the world read the Bible. In many cases, it is used to formulate laws that are enforced on us in different walks of life. Pastors and prophets use the Bible to teach or preach to their congregants. Even politicians are made to hold the Bible as they take an oath of office after elections. This makes the Bible a critical manuscript that we surely cannot live without. But do we really know who wrote it or how it was written? In this special episode of the book series, I called a professor of biblical studies and Northwest Semitic languages at the University of California, Los Angeles. His new book, Who Really Wrote the Bible? The Story of the Scribes, was published by Princeton University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. We spoke earlier this morning. Professor William, thank you so much for making the time today. I'm a happy man to have you on the podcast today to discuss your new book. I'm very much interested in this book. Like I told you that we are running a series on world religions, and the book perfectly fits into the collection that we are actually creating. We have covered quite a number of books, about 6 of them, which makes you the 7th guest to speak on this broader theme. So yeah, I'm going to want us to start our conversation. We are obviously going to start with the introductions. I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, to talk about the work that you've been doing right before this book, where you're currently teaching, the courses that you are teaching. Basically just that.
I'm in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and I teach biblical studies and Northwest Semitic inscriptions. I mean, my background is in the field. I studied as an undergraduate religion and economics, and then I went and studied in Israel and did a master's degree at a place called Jerusalem University College. And then I went and did my PhD at Brandeis University, had a postdoc in Israel at Jerusalem, at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. I've been a visiting scholar at the Hebrew University. But I've been teaching at UCLA for the last 30 years, and a lot of my teaching is graduate students. So I've trained 30 PhDs, more than 30 PhDs who are teaching all over the world in various colleges and universities. But I also teach undergraduate classes. One of my major undergraduate classes is a course called Jerusalem, the Holy City, which was an interesting class to be teaching this last year. But it really focuses on the history of Jerusalem as sacred space for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from beginning until the modern period. But I also teach courses like Introduction to the Bible, or History of the Jewish People, or Dead Sea Scrolls for undergraduates. And then I teach graduate seminars, training people to be professors like me in Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel and a lot of stuff on inscriptions, history of Hebrew language, things like that. So the easy class to catch is the Jerusalem, the Holy City class, because actually it's going to be offered online next year.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Wonderful. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to sign up for the classes that are taught by Professor William, do not forget to click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. So now let's get to start to talk about this book. Who really wrote the Bible? I love that you put the word "really" wrote the Bible. The story of the scribes. It tells me you have something to actually say. And I noticed that you have written a book before, published in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, in which you also talk about how the Bible was, put together to be a book actually. And I can see you have a whole history, probably 30 years of doing research on biblical studies And that's quite a pretty good history that you have that puts you in a very good position to give us some very valuable insights on this particular topic. So what would you say are the core ideas of this book, and what is its central argument?
So, yeah, I'm glad you noticed some of the earlier work. I have been working on it for the problem for a while from different perspectives. This book tries to address the people who wrote the Bible, who they were, where they came from, how they worked, and the subtitle is, the story of the scribes. So it's also a history in that respect. If you look at the table of contents of the book, you can see I've organized it historically from the beginning with the early scribes through the development of writing and professions into the Persian period when the scribal community narrows but the Bible comes together in its sort of final form. I mean, I wrote earlier books that, how the Bible became a book was really about a different question, which is the question of, like, why should there be a Bible at all in ancient Israel? Because this is a rural community, right? It's not like writing should have been important. And I wrote a book that appeared about 4 years ago about scribal curriculum in ancient Israel, and it was about how scribes learned to read and write. So, like, what were the books? What were their textbooks, right? And so, what were the machinations of learning that? And when I was writing that last book, I observed that the focal point of writing, or how you learn to write, was in apprenticeship. Masters taught students. And there weren't formal schools. Everything was done in an apprenticeship kind of manner, not unlike learning to be a potter or learning where it's a trade. And writing is a skill in a trade. It's not a profession in itself. So we don't really have authors. And so when I was writing, I was recognizing that. I was asking myself, well, if writing is a skill in a profession and it's learned through apprenticeship, what are the implications of that observation? What's the evidence for it, and what's the implications once we figure that out? So that's what this book is about, sort of in longer explanation.
That's great. Thank you so much for that quick summary. One of the things we are very particular about on this program is the book's contribution to biblical studies. Right. I don't know if I should say canonical studies, but I would like you to take us through that explanation as to how does the book contribute, because I understand this book comes out in 2024. There are obviously several scholars of biblical studies that have endeavored to write about, related subject matter. How different is your book, and what major contribution does it make to that conversation that's already in existence?
Yeah, actually, the title, Who Really Wrote the Bible, partly reflects the fact that the title Who Wrote the Bible has already been taken by a book by Richard Elliott Friedman that appeared, like 40 years ago. I wasn't really writing this book as a response to his book, but that book, it reflects sort of what I would say is the typical paradigm of the formation of the Bible, which asks about authors. Like, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. Who wrote the book of Isaiah? Isaiah, and the problem with that model is that none of the biblical books have authors. Almost none of them have any authors where it says, I, Moses, wrote X, Y, or Z. Doesn't say that in the book of Genesis. Even the book of Isaiah, it begins in third person. These are the words that Isaiah, this is the vision that Isaiah saw, not these are the words that I wrote. So Isaiah never speaks as an author, almost never speaks as an author in the book of Isaiah. Moses doesn't usually speak as an author. And the question is, like, why don't biblical why doesn't biblical literature have authors? And I think the reason is it's very similar to other great literature, is that authorship wasn't the model, but rather there were communities, scribal communities that collected, edited, preserved, and eventually canonized texts. And that's why the Bible, it's only in the Hellenistic period where authors became a thing. The Hellenistic, works like, Euripides or Aristotle, you have people. And when Jewish literature comes into the Hellenistic period, then the Jews begin asking the question, well, who wrote our books?
Oh, yes.
The problem is that communities of scribes wrote them, collected them, edited them, canonized them, and not individuals. But so the authorship becomes part of the reception of the books, not part of the production of the books.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. You particularly focus on this group of people, the scribes. And I've seen that you have also had some other publications which are also just particularly focused on the scribes. I'm sure there's something particular about them as a community that we can talk about. But I know maybe you can touch on this when you explain the major findings of the book. But now let me give you the opportunity to explain what you consider to be the major findings of the book and the major lessons that we can draw from them.
Yeah, so I would say the major finding of the book is that biblical literature has a different kind of model that for its production. It was produced by communities of scribes as opposed to authors. Authors is not an anachronistic later model that is put upon biblical literature. It's not part of the world of ancient Israel. So that is I think that has significant implications. Also, a scribe is not an author. A scribe is a person who's part of a community that collects, edits, passes on things. An author produces literature. And so the other observation is that scribe actually wasn't a title or a profession in ancient Israel. Scribe is a skill within a profession. So you, for example, might be a soldier, or you might be a bureaucrat, and you learn to read and write, and that was your profession. Your profession was, you could be a priest. Yes. Like, for example, Ezra is a priest. And you don't say, and we don't say, oh, Ezra, that his title is scribe. No, his title is priest, and scribe was a skill within his profession. It's only in the later period, probably in the late Hellenistic Roman period, that scribe actually became a profession in itself. Then when it becomes a profession in itself, it means that the job of this person is to copy texts and make copies of texts. It's still not an author, that is to produce a text.
Yes.
So and I think the model has important implications about like the way we think of biblical literature. I think it's produced by communities. It's not produced by individuals, and it required communities. So you couldn't just sit in your office and write a book. You needed a community. And in order, first of all, you needed to learn the skills, but then you needed the community to essentially distribute the literature. And those communities were professions like priests and merchants and, government bureaucrats and soldiers. And in this book, I sort of outline all the different kinds of professions that started using writing in the literature that's related, in the biblical literature that's related to them. I'd just like to share a couple things here. Let me start like with sharing something from the title of my book, or the table of contents, but this will sort of get me started. So here you should be seeing, the table of contents of my book. And, I've organized it historically on part one, creating the community in the early Iron Age, the scribal communities of the Bible in the second part, and then scribal community that survives essentially creates the canon of the Bible after the exile, mostly between 550 and 350 BC. And then, I talk in the book about like all these different professions in, the service of the state, in the Samaria scribal office, the prophetic scribal community, the scribes of the people of the land, the women as scribes in the Bible, priestly scribes. One of the things I will point out that sort of goes against the paradigm of biblical studies is that priests, there are two ways to think about priests. One is diachronically, there are priests who are writing and scribes in the early periods, but also in the later periods, especially in the later periods, because in the end, the Bible is preserved by priests in the temple in the Persian period. But there are scribes in the earlier periods, priestly scribes in the early periods, both in Jerusalem and in the periphery. So you have central priests and you have peripheral priests. They have two different kinds of literature. And then I just go through examples of one of the things that the model, one of the implications of the model is that if we learn to read and write through communities, then scribes are part of a family. It's both a real family and a fictive family. So, for example, if I go to biblical literature, there's a lot of literature that talks about the sons of scribes. So, for example, in Chronicles, it'll talk about the sons of Shisha who are scribes. And this word "sons of" is a word for a guild. It's a word that reflects apprenticeship. And we have lots of different examples of this apprenticeship model using the word b'nai, or sometimes yeladim, which means children. And this is the way you refer to the people in apprenticeship learning. It's actually true also when we're doing doctoral studies, right? My students refer to me as their doctor father, right? It's a German word. And what does it mean? I'm their doctor father. I'm not really their father, right? It's a fictive model. And I think of them as they're my children, and the students that I studied with in graduate school, they're like my brothers. They're not really my brothers, but there's a fictive group, and it happens when you study together, right? And if that's the way people learn to read and write, then you should see this in various different ways in biblical literature. I think one of my favorite examples is in the book of Isaiah. Like, for example, in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah is talking, and he says, bind up the testimony, his essentially teaching, and seal the teaching among my students. So in the book, it's telling you that Isaiah, in a sense, the book itself isn't being collected or written by Isaiah. It's being done by his students. And then he goes on in verse 18 and he calls these students his children, right? Whom God has given him. So the apprentices of the prophet are then are students. They're not his real students, but they're fictive, essentially part of a fictive kin group. And my favorite, there's lots of examples where we can illustrate the apprenticeship model of learning. One of the really well-known examples is a place called Kintil Rajrud. It's a fortress in the southern part of Israel. It's on a road that's called the Gaza Road. It's the road that goes from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, and it's in the middle of the desert. But at this fortress, they found a bunch of inscriptions, and in these inscriptions, you have different kinds of inscriptions. You have plaster wall inscriptions, you have jar inscriptions, you have storage jars that belong to the commander of the fortress. But like in this central jar that I show right here, look at this. Look at the right-hand side. There's lots of different inscriptions here, but on the very right-hand side of it, you can see a master and a student working together. The red is the master's hand. So you can see how beautiful the master's hand is, right? It's red flowing, and the black is it's the student.
The students.
Yeah, and this is actually something that's very typical, is especially known from ancient Egypt, where it's not just a modern convention that the professor or the teacher uses red ink, right? It actually goes back all the way to ancient Egypt.
Interesting.
Isn't that fun?
I like this.
And you can see some of the rudimentary aspects of it. Look at the shin here. It's SH in Hebrew. And the master writes it, it's like a flowing W, but above it, you see the student is writing, and he writes it as two V's shapes that don't fully connect. So he hasn't quite mastered the development of the stroke. He's got the basic idea, but you can see that there are some aspects of learning that are reflected in the student also. There's another really interesting inscription from Kuntil-Rud called the plaster wall inscription, and they're very fragmentary. But the fun thing about these is on the top right of this particular plaster wall inscription, and these were things that the people at the site were probably memorizing. And this is a fortress in the middle of the desert. So who are these people, right? These have to be students who are learning to read and write, but they're also soldiers. And in this case, the title of this broken literary text is called Na'are Sar, ear, which means the apprentices of the fortress commander. So the title tells you what the text essentially is. It's essentially a text that was meant for memorization. So it's part of their scribal education is to memorize text. We did it in school, right? Like, you have to memorize this poem, or you have to memorize this song, and then you might write an analysis. So poems and liturgy are one of the major components of ancient education. And you see this happening here. In this case, it's for soldiers who are learning to read and write. But let me give you one of the really interesting examples of this. I think probably the most interesting example is in a place called in Jerusalem, and it has to do with the writings of the prophetic scribal community. And I'll start with, here, there are a bunch of seal impressions that were found in excavations in the city of Jerusalem, just south of the Temple Mount. You can see on the front page of this book,
yes.
The southern wall of the temple. And in this excavation area, they found 34 seal impressions from a scribal community called the Sons of Bes. And there were also two seal impressions with the royal insignia, and I'll talk about one of them in a while, and then two seal impressions reflecting a prophetic scribal community that I think is related to our Isaiah. So let me start with these 7 seal impressions of the Sons of Bes. Here's what they look like. I drew this one example. They have 3 different registers. This one is a composite of 3 different seals. So there was one seal that impressed 3 different made 3 different impressions, and so that's this one right here. And then seal impressions 5, 6, 7, and 8 were different seals, but all of them have the expression "son of Bes" in the third seal, third register, a third line of the seal. So that means there are 5 different individuals on the 7 different seal impressions, right? So this is a community, all of whom have son of Bes as their father, right? Whether it's the real father or not, we don't really know. But it's important, because here you see a community of practice, a scribe community working. So then it gets even more interesting. there's one seal impression. It's slightly broken, that belongs to, I translated here, belonging to Isaiah, or in Hebrew, Yeshayahu. And then the final expression says the prophet. Now, there's some discussion among scholars about, like, is this the Isaiah of the Bible?
Of the Bible,
And I think
yes.
it probably is, Now, why do I think it is? Well, for one, the name Isaiah had never, ever appeared in an excavated seal or inscription until this one. And so we have, like, for example, we have an archive from the city of David, where there are 85 different names mentioned in the archive of seal impressions, and the name Isaiah never appears. So, I mean, we have actually literally thousands of inscriptions that have been excavated with names, and this was the first one that had Isaiah. It happens to date to the late 8th century, and it was actually excavated 10 feet away from this seal impression belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the king of Judah. So they were found in the same locus, right? Hezekiah was the king during the days of of Isaiah the prophet in Jerusalem. So that makes it very interesting, and suggestive, right? But actually it becomes even more interesting in terms of my model of prophetic scribal communities, because along with the Isaiah seal, they found a second seal in the excavation in that cache of 34 that mentions Isaiah. And this is it right here below. I drew this one. It says, belonging to Iddo, the son of Isaiah. Now, is this Isaiah his actual son, or is it just his apprentice, right? We don't really know, because sometimes your apprentices, actually the seal itself leaves out the word ben. It says, which means son of. So there's a relationship between the two, but it's not made explicit, and it's unclear what the explicit relationship is. But the name Iddo is also really interesting, because if we look at more carefully, the name Iddo is known in biblical literature. It's also known in ancient inscriptions. So, for example, in number 5 here that I list, this is in a Phoenician inscription known as the Zakor, or not a Phoenician, an Aramaic inscription known as the Zakor stela, and it talks about Adadin, or Iddo, the root for Iddo as seers. So, and in the biblical literature, there are a number of prophets or seers that have this title, Iddo, or they're the son of Iddo, or they use this word Iddo. So this son of Isaiah then, or apprentice of Isaiah, seems to be related to this model of apprenticeship relationships in a prophetic scribal community. It makes it very interesting to sort of reflect on what is the history of the term prophet in the biblical literature and the development of the title prophet. I think that's something I talk about in biblical literature in the Bible. I think in earlier biblical literature, prophets were, like Isaiah, members of sort of the government. They were royal advisors. And then in late biblical literature, they take this title prophet and they use it very broadly, and they apply it to everyone, even where it wasn't probably originally their major title. And it becomes this very, very expansive idea of prophets that we know in Judaism and Christianity. But in the early Iron Age, when we're talking about the 8th century, this is sort of the beginnings of some evidence for a different concept of what the prophet was in biblical literature, and I developed that a bunch in the book too. And that, of course, leads us to this sort of passage that I started with, as a sort of one of the examples, right, of Isaiah of Jerusalem. He has students, right? He calls them his children. Iddo seems to be the student. We find them in the archaeology of Jerusalem together. So that sort of, is a sort of quick outline of some ideas and illustrations of some of the ideas in the book. It's just a little piece of some of the kind of ideas I develop in the book, and I think they transform a number of categories. The whole process of writing and canonization, the role of writing in ancient Israel, and as it relates to professions, as opposed to this concept of authors. So that's the quick
Snapshot
overview for you. Yeah.
of wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I should say, your book is of fundamental importance to a lot of people, but I would want you to, personally describe what you feel like is the target audience of the book. The last time I checked, I think some study which came out in June was saying that we have about 2.4 billion followers or billion Christians the world over, and this makes it like a religion that is like 31% of the world population. This becomes the largest religion on the face of the earth, and this means that subjects like a book like this is of fundamental importance to people who consider the Bible to be the center of their religious beliefs and practices. What would you say is the target audience of the book, and why should people take seriously this discourse?
Yeah, I wrote this book generally for a general audience. I didn't write it just for scholars. Now, I think a lot of some of the ideas are very important to changing the scholarly discourse, but I didn't aim it that way, and I wrote it, I would say, in an as accessible way as possible, which is why I'm really proud of the fact that I have 51 illustrations in the book, because I think illustrations really help that general audience. I also make a point at the beginning of the book is my book isn't intended to prove the Bible or disprove the Bible. I don't think the Bible needs an apologetic. It doesn't need to be proved. And it can't be disproved. There are things about it, that need context. There's a lot of the Bible that needs an enormous amount of context. So what I'm really trying to do is give, biblical literature a context. And so, I hope that people of different faiths will find this useful and helpful. Sometimes it's pushing back against some traditional models of authorship. But usually, like in the Christian tradition or in the Jewish tradition, we don't usually have a dictation model of authorship. In other words, we don't think, God dictated the Bible. Usually we have more of an interactive model in those traditions, but there are very conservative traditions that would find this challenging as an approach. But it's not meant to be challenging. It's meant to be contextualizing. And I like to think of the Bible as a book that's produced by the community and then transmitted by the community, and it highlights the centrality of the community as opposed to the individual. And I think that fits well with the ancient context and the importance of community as opposed to individual. I think the centrality of the individual in the production and authorship of the Bible is a very Western idea. It begins with the Greeks, but it carries on into the West. And I think that pushing that model is a very Western imposition on biblical literature. So in a lot of ways, this is a critique of that Western idea, not intentionally, but fundamentally, yes, it is.
That's great. It's been wonderful learning from you, Professor William. I'm very much happy to have had you on the program. Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to buy a copy of this book, Who Really Wrote the Bible, The Story of the Scribes, you can access it on the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video. Thank you so much, Professor William, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.